Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel tonight, and thank you so much for joining us for this year's Fort Collins Book Fest. I'm Margaret Mizushima, author of the Timber Creek Canine Mysteries, featuring Deputy Maddie Cobb, her canine partner Robo, and veterinarian Cole Walker. I have 7 books in the series out right now, and the 8th episode comes out March 7th. So I'm getting very excited about launching a new book. We have a wonderful panel here tonight with Mandy Miller and JC Rivers coming up. But before we get started, I'd like to recognize a few of our festival sponsors. The Book Fest is produced by Poudre River Public Library District. Our presenting sponsors are Old Firehouse Books, the Colorado State University Libraries, and CSU English Department. Further support has been provided by Colorado Creative Industries, Poudre River Friends of the Library, Poudre Library Trust, Colorado Humanities, Front Range Community College, and Liggett, Johnson, and Goodman. And our amazing media partners, KUNC and 105.5, the Colorado Sound. Thank you to them all. Well, we'll get started with our session right now. I'm very excited to introduce both of our panelists. I'd like to introduce Mandy Miller first. Mandy is a novelist and an attorney. She is the author of the Grace Locke novels, including States of Grace and Friday Night in the Glades. She holds a JD from Northwestern University, as well as a PhD degree in psychology. She specializes in the representation of the mentally ill and criminally insane. The first half of her career was spent as a mergers and acquisitions attorney on Wall Street, where the clientele was better dressed than her criminal clients, but frequently equally devious. In her spare time, she indulges her reading and shoe vices and participates in ultra marathons, a sport much like writing a novel, in that the journey is long and requires dedication, not to mention a dash of madness. That is the truth. Now I'd like to introduce JC Rivers. JC Rivers is a Kentucky-rooted, Colorado-based author. Rivers uses suspenseful, science-based storytelling to draw attention to environmental issues. She has 2 decades of conservation and sustainability experience and has degrees in environmental policy and global politics. When Rivers is not out trying to save the world in her own way, she spends time with her family, immerses herself in other cultures, and seeks adventure in the great outdoors. While Chemical Signals is her first novel, it will not be her last. Learn more about her work at her website, which is jcriversofficial.com. So welcome to both Mandy and JC. And we want to get right to learning more about your work. So we're going to have you read an excerpt for us first off. And if you'd like, go ahead and give us a brief description of your book as well. So Mandy, we're going to start with you.
All righty. So my book is basically somewhere between crime fiction and I'm just checking so you can hear me fine, Margaret.
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
So it's somewhere between crime fiction, legal thriller, It's mystery in terms of who done it or who didn't do it. But there's those things in the genre that are a little complicated. So my main character, Grace, is a disabled veteran. And I think I'll just start right there. I'm gonna start at the beginning of the book. So
Okay.
Margaret, if you could give me like a timeout sign or something, so I know when I'm like a minute from finishing, that would be really good.
I'll do
So
that.
this is the first chapter in States of Grace, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Innocence isn't it's all cracked up to be. A truly innocent client, one who didn't do it, that's the rare, unfortunate soul that will keep you up nights and hijack your brain like a catchy song. And if Lady Luck forsakes him, that's the client who will haunt you forever. Innocence is funny that way, seems like a good thing on the surface, but at its core, it's a burden. I don't have to worry about innocence today, or almost any other day for that matter. Defendants are in the habit of being guilty of something, even if it's not what they're charged with. At least that's what I used to say. Winning's important, but thankfully, I'm going home a loser today for sure. And right now, that's all I want to do, go home. Assuming you can call the Hurricane Hotel home. The jury will be back soon to announce the inevitable. We find the defendant guilty. How do I know he's guilty? Because my client, the accused, the one slumped down in the chair to my right, his bony frame swamped by the funeral director suit I bought for him at Goodwill. He did it, no questions asked. Told me so himself. Said he beat the crap out of his girlfriend because she smoked his last crack rock. Said the only thing she had the sense to do was not call the cops, at least until some do-gooder counselor convinced her to file a report. But lucky for him, that time, the bruises were gone. She had it coming, and that bitch counselor at the shelter will get it too if I ever see her again, was what he told me in the holding cell. Then, for good measure, as what I can only assume he saw as added incentive for me to do my job, he added, Grace, you get me out of this hole and I'll show you what a real man can do for your bad attitude. Willing my face to be devoid of emotion, as his hollow eyes, I told him he wouldn't have no trouble himself with my happiness or lack thereof, because the moment the jury heard his story, the well-worn yarn about girlfriend falling in bathtub, the outcome was as predictable as another steamy day in Florida. And that's how it went, his eyes echoing off the courtroom walls, like prayers from a non-believer who found his way into a church in a last-ditch effort to save himself. And I'm going to skip ahead here. I understand you have a verdict, Madam Foreperson, Judge Grant says, peering over his half-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses at a world-weary 40-something woman. I knew she'd be the foreperson from the jump. With her slit-eyed scowl, she'd scare the others into submission quickly so she could get home to reality TV to escape her own. Yes, Your Honor. If I have a superpower, it's the ability to spot a lie, from clients' excuses for their bad choices to cops' flimsy explanations for how an accused developed a raging shiner after the cuffs were on. I've even become good at telling myself a few lies, such as the one about how I keep defending the types I used to lock up. The defendant shall rise.
About one more minute. Go ahead. No, about one more minute.
The defendant shall rise, the judge says. Get to my feet, but stay more an arm's length away from my client. The clerk holds the verdict form like a town crier and clears his throat. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant not guilty. Hot damn. Yes, my client yells, his fist pummeling the air as if he's hitting a heavy bag. A refrigerator lands on my chest, and I struggle to catch my breath. I pivot to the jury box. Judge Grant stands, arms wide, face expressionless. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for your service. You are hereby excused.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Mandy. This will be fun to talk about a little later, so thank you. Oh, JC, let's hear a little bit about your book, Chemical Signals.
Sure. Chemical Signals is an environmental thriller. I tried to create an easy reading book to make the environmental issues accessible to everyone, as well as the science that's helping to resolve these issues accessible to everyone. So I tried to just make a book that was really approachable. There's a lot of different characters in the book. We'll talk about that later, I hope, but it's my goal was to create some connections with people so that they would maybe want to explore these issues further. And so I'm going to read the opening of this book, Chemical Signals, as well. While this scene does not include my some of my main characters, I think it gives a really good sense for the kind of the pace and the plot and the tone. And yeah, okay, so I'll just go right into it here.
Okay.
Shh. I think we just need to go a little further, Clara whispered to Marcel, holding his hand as they crept down the game trail that led out from a pull-off where they had parked up the road. Why are we being so secretive, Clara? This is a business. Can't you just go there and ask them your questions like a normal person? Marcel asked, his tone half laughing, half annoyed. Well, if there are nefarious things happening there, then we won't see them if we announce we're coming. And she shot him a mischievous smile. Clara was whimsical and loved adventure. She was a budding investigative journalist with just enough street savvy to keep her safe and just a little too much trust in the world. Marcel was also studying journalism, but his beat was going to be humanitarian crises and war zones. He also loved a good adventure. It's like we're practicing for the real thing. One day, when we have a big story, we may actually have to do stuff like this, said Clara as the stacks of logs came into sight. There it is, she whispered. Wow, this looks pretty high tech for tree stuff. I guess I didn't expect to see so much equipment and so much security. Guess they do have some pretty expensive trees in there. Clara heard that a new mill operation had opened a little less than a year ago. They were making high-end finished products from hardwood trees, mostly from the Appalachian Mountains and other Kentucky groves. Rumor had it they were making products for celebrities and high-end buyers. Clara was curious what would draw in that kind of clientele. Plus, it was a great way to spend a Tuesday afternoon, way better than being at home studying. Just then, an Audi pulled up the dirt road, rang the intercom, and waited for the lock gate to swing open. It looked like there were 3 men in the car, but the windows were tinted, so it was hard to tell. A man came out from inside the main building to greet them. One man stepped out from the passenger side, then the driver got out and stood by the back door of the car. Clara strained to hear what they were saying, but they were too far away. It looked heated, and in a flash, guns were pulled. Holy crap, this just got really interesting. I think we should get out of here, Clara. Whatever's going on here, we don't want any part of it, said Marcel. Shh, just another minute. Let's see how this plays out. She remained hunkered in the dark light of the trees bordering the property. The sloping hill down to the mill property was protected by a tall chain link fence. The driver opened up the back door and a man dressed in a long flowing white Kandura stepped out and walked around the back of the car as the passenger continued to point a gun at the man who had come out from inside the building. The driver also had his hand on a gun at his hip. Claire turned around to look at Marcel with surprise in her eyes and all of a sudden lost her balance, falling backward onto a pile of duff. The sound of sticks cracking echoed loudly down the draw. All of the men turned and looked up the hill. The driver pulled his gun and started firing in their direction. Clara and Marcel turned to run. Their car was just a few paces back down the game trail. Marcel stumbled and moaned, grabbing his arm, and then looked down to realize his hand was covered in blood. Adrenaline pulsed through them both. Clara grabbed his bloody hand and dragged the car. They jumped in, whipped a U-turn, and sped back in the direction they had come from, turning off onto an old, narrow dirt road that Clara knew cut through the forest and back to the interstate. It was definitely the road less traveled. Clara only knew this forest road because there was a good climbing back in there. Her roommates had taken her a few times. She realized she was hyperventilating. She couldn't focus on the road and on Marcel at the same time. She knew she needed to pull over to help him. She wasn't sure how injured he actually was. He was in shock and kept saying, "I can't believe they shot me." After about 10 minutes of driving, when she was sure they weren't being followed, she steered the car into a pull-off on the narrow dirt road. Marcel moaned and looked very pale. He was starting to sweat. "Oh, I've watched enough crime dramas and hospital shows to know that this needs a tourniquet to stop the bleeding until we can get you to a hospital." And she jumped out of the car and ran around to his side, opening the door to have better access to his arm. He leaned out of the car when she opened the door and threw up.
Oh, wow. So we got two real thrillers going on here. Lots of action. That's the way I like my books. So that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now we're going to move into the interview part of our panel tonight. And one of the things the description of our panel talks about is the tenets of mystery writing and how you all made them your own. So I have kind of selected some questions based on what I consider some of the most important elements of a good mystery, thriller, suspense, crime fiction. So we're going to launch into this. And Mandy, we're going to start with you, but I'm going to ask you both to answer this question. So first of all, I think writing a mystery and plotting it is a hard job. And I want to know what inspired you to write your first mystery.
So Margaret, if I am going to start, then first of all, loveliness to the Poudre County Library Association, or I might have gotten that wrong, and Rochelle and her colleagues, because it's such a gift, correct? To be able for people to sort of log in to this kind of discussion with writers and hackers, and me and JC, we just try to, writers, we're doing our jobs in sort of silence. So, well, thank you to the Library Association and to you, Margaret. I love your books. So anybody who's not looking, who hasn't seen her books before, definitely check them out. Anyways, my view is with mystery, what brings me to mystery is I've always been a reader, I guess a writer that hasn't been a reader, and I work as an editor. And when someone tells me, "Oh, I don't have time to read books," I'm like, what kind of crazy person is that doesn't have time to read books? Of course, it's not going to be my editing client. But so for me, I've always read mystery. I grew up in the UK, so I'm from Scotland originally. And so, my childhood was Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes. I didn't know there was more modern things than this. So what brought me to mystery is what brings everyone to mystery is the mystery. I think the human mind works that they will try to find alternative sources of explanations for things that might be obvious, like Occam's razor, right? The Occam's razor is the most simplistic explanation, is the answer to the question, but not necessarily in mystery, thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd all be out of work. So I'm reading this book right now by Maria Konnikova called The Biggest Bluff, about her life in poker playing. And she's a psychologist like me. And I'm like, oh, if Occam's razor was it, then we'd all be done. So I love Robert B. Parker. I loved in my earlier life Agatha Christie. And I just kind of love the stuff I hate now. Plotting. Like, how did these people fit the plot together in this weird way? And I study that now, and I still suffer. So
Yeah.
I really admire the people who can, like Peter Swanson. If you have not read Peter Swanson, he's certainly, well-selling author. But that man plots like in my dreams. I could never plot like that. I'm a total pantser. So that's kind of my thing. I came to mystery writing because I love mystery books, but
And
I'm not anywhere near that.
well, thank you for adding some of your favorite authors to our reading list tonight. It sounds great. And one of the things I did before I decided to write my first mystery was to read mysteries for a year. I read them for a whole year before I started. But JC, let's move on to you and hear what brought you to mystery writing. What's your inspiration?
Well, I've got a bunch of inspirations, but I'll start with one that is maybe a little bit different than Mandy's in that, I was teetering on the bridge of a midlife crisis about at that age where, stuff's about ready to, you're gonna make some really bad decisions in life, buy a car you can't afford, or I don't know, I have curly hair, cut bangs, that's like the worst. And so I was trying to decide what I was going to do for my midlife crisis, and thought rather than paying a whole lot of money for therapy or something, I would just try to write a book, because I've been trying for 20 years to write a book, and thought, well, this might be the way to get me through it. So when I sat down and I was like, okay, I'm going to finally do this. I'm going to finally write this book, and I'll talk about Mimi and hopefully later if we get into characters. But, I just had this one character in my head for like a long time, and I thought I knew what she was going to do. And then I sat down to start writing about her, and I was like, oh, this is not the book I'm writing. And I was like, I want to write the books that I like to read. Why am I trying to force myself into a genre that I don't write in, or that I don't read? Why am I going to write in a genre I don't read? And when I think about when I'm going through an airport and I just, I love literary fiction. I mean, right now I'm like huge on Frederick Backman, the Beartown series, Anxious People. I mean, everything, I can't read enough of his work, but I also love to just grab an easy read commercial suspense book. I mean, I love Dan Brown, his ability to take you places and teach you things you didn't even know you were being taught when he was teaching you them in his books. Baldacci and his just ability to write super captivating stories. Sandra Brown, like she just pulls you in and keeps you through the whole book. And I mean, one of my favorite authors is Carl Hyacin, and he writes like he's inspired me in my environmental writing. Like I just love and adore him, and he's so funny. And so when I was thinking about, well, when I look at my bookshelf, what's the majority? What do I enjoy the most? And so I decided that was the genre I wanted to write in, was the one that I liked the best. So my inspiration was avoiding midlife crisis and trying. I'm nowhere close to emulating the authors and them through the writing process. And like Mandy, once you start writing, it's hard to read books for fun anymore. I'm like constantly like seeking out the red herring, doing all the things. I'm like, this book I'm just going to read because I want to read it. I'm not going to study it.
Yes, I saw that some of what you had to say really resonated with Mandy. So yeah,
My
sounds
God.
good.
And Carl
Good.
Hyacin, oh my God, as a former Floridian, oh my God, it just like makes me laugh out loud. But then it makes me jealous, like how clever he is. Like, oh, you might be like, oh yeah, this is the book I picked up in the airport. And then you're like, oh my God, to write that book,
Yeah.
what that took, right? So much
Yeah.
more. I really love what JC said for that. And then the other thing I wrote down here when she was speaking was like an easily readable or accessible thing about the environment. And I think so much we read that is in fiction
Mhm.
now is too preachy. And I really love that idea of like seeding it in to an actual story. I love that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, we're going to move on to talking about characters because I feel like that's a really important element of the mystery. And I think good crime novels start with character, for me anyway. And you two have created some really strong, interesting protagonists for your book. So I would like to kind of start with the main character of your book. And JC, I would like you to go first this time. And please tell us about Mimi Martin and how you created her.
Yeah, so Mimi has been floating around in my head for a long time. But I'm kind of one of those weird creative types, and so I'm always coming up with ideas. And originally, I thought she was going to be in a rom-com, as I just mentioned. I thought she was going to be a kind of antithesis character in a love story because I knew who she was to start. But throughout the book, she really evolved for me. So she starts off as a pretty cold, standoffish person, probably because she was an only child of Niles and Hay. She, her parents, as much as they loved her, were super career focused. Niles is another primary character in my book. Her father, he's super busy, had a big career as a lawyer and an FBI investigator. Her mother, writing and off on book tours. And so, Mimi had a lot of time to herself. And throughout the book, though, and that's what I think caused her to be so closed off. And her parents had high expectations. So she's also very anxious. And it's easy for me to write that because I struggle with anxiety as well. So it's a familiar place for me to be. And so that part, writing that into her was simple. I'm also a very emotional person. So writing a character that doesn't express emotion easily was really hard for me. But she grew throughout the book, not too much. She still doesn't love hugs or anything like that, but she really learned, I think, how to receive more emotion. And I really love the relationship that she has with it, that she grows throughout the book with her friends and what that brings. And, for me, her as a character, really, she's just kind of a mashup of things that I really admire in people that I've come across in my life: her strength, her tenacity, her ability to kind of move through situations with perspective. And even though, like any kid in college, they question where they're going, she really at the core knows who she is. And when I meet somebody that's like that, I'm just, super impressed. So I don't know. I love Mimi. And thanks for the question.
Yeah, I can tell that you're passionate about Mimi.
Mhm.
And thank you also for talking a little bit about character arc through your book and that she does grow and change during your stories. So that sounds great. And we're going to move now to Mandy. And your protagonist is a down and out disgraced prosecutor named Grace Locke. Very good. Tell us more about Grace and how you created her. I think you are muted, Mandy.
Okay, there we
Now you
go.
can
I'm
start.
muted again. I didn't want to make noise for JC. So yeah, I'm glad you like the lock. The lock for philosophers might be interesting, but yeah, I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, so I've done that for many years. So part of me, my first half of my professional life was spent being a fancy pants corporate lawyer. And then my second half was spent, oddly, being a criminal defense lawyer. And so I have an odd transition there. And Grace is a veteran who was a fancy pants lawyer. But then on 9/11, everything changed for her. And she was in the military and she lost a leg basically in the military. So part of me is like people look at that and they think, because particularly people who know me as a lawyer, they're like, oh, is Grace you? And I'm like, well, clearly not. I have both my legs. But I also really appreciate my friends who served. And so she's a little bit of a composite character from people who I've learned about and who I kind of was. I mean, I was a criminal defense lawyer. I represented the worst of the worst. So I know what that feels like. I know what they're like. But on the other hand, I don't have the zealotry that she had when she was a prosecutor before she was fallen. So she's a little bit of a paradox that way. And I was hoping, I mean, I didn't write her this way. She kind of came to me kind of fully formed in a weird way. She's a sort of like an amalgam of paradoxes. So that was how I wanted to keep her. Not necessarily sure, not necessarily sober, not necessarily on the side of the bad guy, not necessarily on the side of the good guy. And I didn't do this because I knew it was going to be a series. I just knew it because that was how she came to me. So I was like, yeah, I'm with her now. But
Good.
I wasn't 100% sure that this would be how she would stay.
Very interesting. Really great. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you both for sharing about your characters. And we could probably talk about character for another 10, 15 minutes, but we're going to move on to setting because it's another great element for a mystery. And Mandy, we'll start with you. What setting did you select for your novel and how did you use it to develop conflict for your protagonist?
Clearly, if you read my novels, they're set in South Florida. I was so like I said, I was a fancy pants lawyer. I was a Wall Street lawyer and for like 15 years of my career, and then I moved to Florida. I did a bunch of different things there, long story, but basically I became a criminal defense lawyer in South Florida. It was the best job I ever had. I mean, hands down, to all my people, setting for me is the antithesis of character. So I love South Florida is hot and sweaty and sunny, and my character is dark. So there's a paradox in the setting and the character. And as the character gets darker, the setting gets lighter. And I kind of like that contrast. I have a PhD in psychology, so I'm like a weirdo. But I do like the contrast effect of character dark, setting light. Because there's nothing more disturbing for anyone if they're having the worst day of their life for it to be sunny outside, right?
Yeah.
Because there's something about that that's weird. It's like, why am I so bad when it looks so lovely outside and transferring, like jumping that shark outside to like, oh, I'm good now. It's fine. No, that just doesn't happen that way. So
Yeah.
for me, South Florida is, I like it because I know it and I can describe certain things that I've seen there. If you read the books, you'll see it. If you live there, you know those people. If you don't live there, you're like, oh, I would love to see that. That's weird. So I kind of go for that. So that's my setting thing. And honestly, Margaret, my favorite thing, writing is setting.
Mhm, mhm.
I love to write setting way more, and people love the setting more than anything else. And that's
Yeah.
because I love to write setting.
Setting,
A
yeah.
lot of writers hate that, but I like writing setting.
Yeah, so do I. Well, thanks for giving us a peek into your reasoning behind your setting. Sounds great. JC, in chemical signals, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit because it takes us to several different settings. Kentucky horse farms, Vietnam, and the Amazon. And did you travel to all those places in your book? Or how did you describe things in such detail?
Thanks, Margaret. And I'll agree with Mandy that I love writing setting, and just like you do too. So I was born, raised, and educated in the great state of Kentucky. So it was very easy for me to draw on my deeply ingrained knowledge of that state when I write about horse farms and Keeneland, and spent much of many years of my life in that area. And in terms of Brazil, I have traveled to Brazil quite a few times. And in terms of a part of my book takes place in Manaus and down the Purus River and in the Amazonas area. And so I have traveled extensively in the Ecuadorian Amazon and in the Atlantic rainforest of Brazil, but have not been to Manaus. I've also traveled in Asia, but not specifically to Vietnam. And so for me, the fun part was figuring out what those places would be like since I hadn't seen them. So I used Google Earth, I used Google Street View. I would find places in the city that I thought looked interesting along a river, and then I would use Google Street View to walk down and look at all the buildings, talk to friends who had traveled to those places, looked at their photographs. So really tried to get did a lot of research to make sure how I was describing things was accurate. The number of maps, I don't know, spent 10 hours looking at all kinds of topographic maps of the Amazon and understanding the drainages and the waterways and the roadways that were being cut in there, satellite imagery. So if I hadn't been there, I worked really hard to try to feel like I had been. And in the scene where Kiki is at the Botanic Gardens in Brazil, I've been to that exact place, and so it was really easy for me to write that as well.
I was curious, is illegal logging a large-scale problem across the globe?
Okay, well, I'm going to try to not be preachy because I know that some people don't like that, but yes, illegal logging is a real problem. That's why I wanted to daylight it. In fact, it is somewhere between a $51 billion and $152 billion industry annually. That is the scale of the problem. We can't measure it exactly because, I mean, $100 billion is a big difference, but that's because we truly just don't know. But just for scale, really quickly, of our world. That's about 4 billion hectares. Most of the world measures forest in hectares. And almost half of those, 31% of forests, are located in 5 countries alone: Russia, Brazil, Canada, US, and China. And so on average, net loss of forest per year is about 5 million hectares. And the experts say that illegal logging contributes to about half of that. So it is a very big problem because when we lose those forests, they provide habitat for biodiversity, they clean our air, they sequester carbon, which helps us address climate change, they provide clean water, medicines, all those things. So when the forests are gone, they're gone, and we lose all of that. So illegal logging is driving a huge part of forest loss across the globe because it is such a big and thriving Black market industry. So the Brazilian Amazon is where a lot of that's happening. So that's why I chose that as a setting for my book, to bring it really to the heart of where it's occurring mostly.
Wow, thank you.
Isn't that interesting, Margaret? The writers, like, you know, the first Grace book is about the pill mill industry, and I what JC was saying is like so fascinating, a way to bring an issue to people in a kind of not preachy way, like here's the story, and then they're like, oh, this is a thing. So I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think that many authors and many crime fiction authors like to highlight some kind of injustice, whether it's social,
For sure.
or domestic, or, you know, there's some kind of injustice going on, and that's what we want to highlight in our books. And so we each pick a theme and we develop the book around that. We're coming close to needing to switch to our audience questions. So I have one more question for each of you. And I'd like you to kind of keep your answers, I'm looking at the time, keep your answers to about 1 minute to 2 minutes each.
No worries.
And I'm going to start with you, Mandy, and we're going to talk about secondary characters real quick here. Mandy, Grace's client is the daughter of the beauty queen who stole Grace's husband. Now there's a challenge for a defense attorney right there. Could you give us a description of those two characters and any other strong secondary characters you want to talk about?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, Margaret. Gretchen, the mom of the beauty queen character that Grace represents in the first book, I'm not sure she won't return, because I think that they have a little copacetic, maybe diametrically opposed interests or style. But also clearly the biggest secondary character in the first Grace book and in the second is Vinny, the mobster landlord, right? So Vinny is her North Star. So what happens with Vinny may ultimately be, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the next books. But so I think Vinny, like so many people that write me about Grace, they're like, oh, we love Vinny. We need to have more from Vinny. Like he's the star, right? And I think there's a reason for that. And when we get to the next characters, we'll talk about that. But I do like Zoe, the girl who is exonerated in the end. And I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with her. So I think you can't, in terms of secondary characters, and I think JC will probably say this too, you cannot have them be stand-ups. You cannot have them be false men. You cannot have them be just people who are there. I always tell people I edit, your secondary characters cannot be the foils for your first characters, because that will never work. They have to be characters. They cannot be foils. They have to be characters with certain characteristics, certain things that you want to carry forward, certain things that you love about them. They cannot be foils. So secondary characters cannot be disposable, would be ultimately my last thought about that.
Unless you decide you want to kill them in your next book, which you might dispose of them that way, but that's another topic. So yeah, they have to be fully fleshed out, that is for sure. And JC, you've created Mimi's father, Niles, and her roommates and friends in the house she's living in. And how did you come up with those characters? And feel free to throw any others in that you want to talk about.
Oh, thank you. You know, it's funny. People coming fully formed, it was almost like a cast at the end of a play, just like walked across the stage and I had the book in my hands. I drew Mimi on a piece of paper and then started making an orbit around her, and everybody just kind of really easily filled in around her. It was really a beautiful thing for me. It was happens like that. But Niles, so I am an absolute sucker for bad dad jokes. I have been my whole life. And so, and I also have a thing for, so I don't know if you guys watched Madam Secretary, that show, like Henry McCord, Tim Daly that plays that, like his character or anything with Harrison Ford, like those are the characters in male characters that really stand out to me. And so when I was thinking about Niles, it was like, okay, he was very much more of like a movie character than a book character in my mind, but he was just so easy to write, and I absolutely adored him. And the friends, no friend is like a friend of mine. It's not anything like that, but I did live in a setting in a large college house with the most beautiful people. And if they weren't in my house, they were in my orbit in college and some other house that we would spend time at. And so we had this incredibly beautiful friend group in college. And so bringing that essence to Mimi, I wanted her to feel that, because she had been so alone so much of her life, except for Clara. And so Clara is probably one of my favorite characters, and she might be making an appearance in another book. But I think one of the more fun characters for me to write, just in my last one, would be Kiki. I really wanted a strong woman in STEM in my book. And I really wanted to bring the science, the forensic science, the environmental science to the forefront, and highlight women in science. And so Kiki was really fun to write for that purpose, because I intentionally wanted that character in the book. So it was really fun. That was one I love setting, but I also just loved making Mimi's orbit. It was great.
Yeah. Oh, that is wonderful. And thanks so much for giving us that little tip about developing your character and then your secondary characters around there. That is really good. We're not going to have too much time to talk about plot because we want to move to our audience questions. We might talk about plot depending upon how many audience questions we have, but we're going to transition to that now. And we have a question here from John, and he is asking, and JC, we'll probably start with you. He is asking, how do you determine how much to give away early and how to spread out the information, details, clues along the way, and how to mislead without lying? So it's kind of really a two-pronged question about how much do you determine,
Margaret?
what do you want, how much do you want to give away early? And then, you know, you don't want to lie to your readers. So how do you avoid that?
You know, it's really interesting. So I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite things about mystery writing is the red herring, right? You want to be thrown for a loop. And I actually, in writing my book, wrote it almost like I was watching a movie in my head. It was just came out. And afterwards, I had to go back and move things around because I was giving away too much too early. And so I also received some feedback. I had some beta readers and asked them if they thought my crux was too soon, because I had a lot that I had to clear up at the end. And so I got some feedback from people about if they liked it or not, and then moved some things around and got some additional feedback. But I think it's really important to give enough upfront that people are interested and want to keep reading, and put your red herring out there early enough in the book that people have time to kind of question it as you go along. So for me, it was a little bit of trial and error. This is my first book, so I'm sure I didn't knock it out of the park or anything like that. But it was a very purposeful and intentional process of going back and moving stuff so I wouldn't be giving away too much too soon.
And what about the lying part, JC? How do you mislead without lying?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
It's a really good question. I think you have to give enough clues that are legitimate, but it is right. It's right on the edge for some, especially not so much in my book, but a lot of the books I read. I see that a lot. It's a fine line. It's a really fine line. And I think characters can lie. So you don't have to lie, but your characters can lie. So your characters can mislead. You don't have to do it yourself. So if you really want to throw somebody for a loop, your character throws them for a loop, not your annotation of what the character is doing.
And I write police procedurals, and it is perfectly legal for a police officer to lie to a person in an interview. So I don't know how Mandy feels about that, but we will move on to Mandy's take on how to determine how much to give away in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of structural issue with this. So I'm kind of a nerd about point of view, structure. So I think part of it is who knows what at what point in time, depending on what point of view you're writing from. So you have to obviously decide that early on as the writer, but I'm a little bit of a nerd that way about structure being the best friend of writers. So to learn more in terms of craft about writing and point of view, I think there's ways to manage that. So I also think that sometimes people, even if you're in the first person point of view, that you don't necessarily say the things you want to say because you don't want to say them, right? So I think for me, what is known and what is unknown sometimes becomes a structural thing. Like, how am I going to structure this novel, structure this short story? So who knows what at different points in time.
Yeah, yeah. And do you have a thought on misleading without lying in your book too?
Yeah, I mean, you can have a person mislead, but you can't have it be that person who suddenly that's out of character for. So you can have a person mislead if this is a person who's kind of all over the place for all time. But I always tell when people ask me, point of view or what you tell a reader is not for the convenience of the author. It's much more for the knowledge of the reader. So if you suddenly like flip back and forth between point of views, between purposes that only suit the editor or the author, then that's kind of obvious. I mean, we've all read books like that where we feel like we're sort of like, shoved back and forth between different points of view. So I think the being mysterious ultimately is the handling of the point of view and the timeline, and you have to do that properly versus just ratcheting the reader back and forth. Like, I've read a couple books lately by very well respected authors where I'm like, I am like 2 chapters from the end, and now I'm in a different point of view. And to me, that's cheap. That's cheesy. That doesn't matter to me. Okay, that tells me you are just trying to sell another book. So, I mean, really, it's sort of like the craft and then the story.
Yeah. Okay, very good. We're moving in now to our last questions, I think. We have Adrian in the Q&A section who says, JC, I so enjoyed Chemical Signals and hope that your storytelling will continue. What's
Aw.
next? Yeah. What's next for you and Mimi?
Oh, okay, thank you. So I am working on my second novel right now, a fiction, also an environmental suspense, but Mimi is not the focus of it. Mimi is still figuring out what she wants to do with her life. So she's taken a little break while she sorts that out. And so what's next for me is Clara. Clara is what's next. So she is a secondary character that's taking on a primary role, and her investigative journalism career has taken off, and she has continued to pursue her involvement with the Chemical Signals illegal logging plot. So she plays a pretty critical role throughout the plot, as you heard when I read at the beginning. She was there from the very start, and so that launched her career. And now Clara is heading in to investigate some new environmental issues. And let's just say that the setting for this one is primarily in Africa. So thanks for the question.
Oh, awesome. Yes, thank you for that question. And that sounds really great, JC. Looking forward to it. Mandy, I have a comment back to you from John here that says, thanks, Mandy. I hate the book starting near the end also. And Mandy, I would like to ask you what's going on with you and what can we expect next from you? And will it be another Grace Locke mystery?
It will. So I parted ways with my publisher, So New Publisher, which is, beyond what anybody cares about. But yes, new Grace, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, maybe summertime. I'm already pretty far along. This one seems to have been, I am a total pantser, so I will, say that. So I'm thinking maybe middle summer with Grace, 3.0. And
Yay.
then for everybody that was here, the secondary characters, during COVID, I wrote a Vinny book. So the mobster landlord, so the mobster landlord, who is so close to my heart for many reasons, but because he's based on a former client of mine who shall remain nameless, because then they try to come and kill me. But so I have a Vinny book. So the draft was written in COVID. But the question really becomes whether the first Grace book or the next Grace book or the Vinny book. But then in COVID, I also wrote a historical fiction, totally nothing related to this. It's about Cuba. So, we'll see.
Oh, well, it's exciting to know that we might have other books coming and a Grace Locke book. But it's 8:00 and we need to wrap this up. I want to thank you,
Margaret.
both. Yeah, Mandy and JC, you were great panelists. Thank you both for being here. Thank you to all of the people who attended the panel, and thank you again for all of our sponsors and our technical people who helped us tonight. Thank you so much. Now, if you're interested, oh, you're welcome. You're so welcome. If you're interested in purchasing States of Grace or Chemical Signals, They're available through our partner at Old Firehouse Books, and you can find them also online and order online at www.oldfirehousebooks.com. And if you're local and you go to the store and the books might not be on the shelf or something like that, find a staff person and ask them and go ahead and order that book through them, and they will be sure and get it for you. Now the Fort Collins Book Fest continues through the rest of the month. You can find the schedule on our website at FoCoBookFest.org. That's FOCO bookfest.org. Thanks again, everybody. This was fun.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you,
Yes.
Margaret, and thank you, Poudre River Libraries and Old Firehouse Books,
Absolutely.
and Mandy and Audrey and Rochelle. Thank you all. This has just been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for everybody that tuned in.
Yeah. Thank you so much.